Okay, welcome back to part 2. We'll carry on where we left off. If you want a separate tutorial on these leather clasps, just let me know in the comments. And there's the medallion shape that I was talking about. And now you have to cut a piece of lining using the same pattern piece as before, and then just lay those right sides together on top of each other. Take your trim, in my case this is a rabbit fur trim, and sandwich it between the two layers and pin very well. And now you need to use your zipper foot and get as close to that trim as possible. It'll make the next steps much easier. Now you're going to want to top stitch pretty close to the edge. If the trim is kind of sticking out a little bit, you can just gently push that under the top layer and then stitch it down and it should stay put. And here's how it looks so far. I just have mine pinned because it's a little bit bulky. Don't worry, we'll deal with that later. Now I'm just cutting out the pieces of the lining for the hood. And you don't have to go all the way around the long tail. You can just kind of sort of round the top at the back there instead of doing the long strip. And then you're just going to get out your pins and pin it like usual. After that, you're just going to cut it out, leaving roughly a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then you'll want to begin stitching. And now I'm just notching the seam allowance on the lining just like I did on the main hood. And now you're going to want to iron the seams flat. It's not a big deal getting like right into that small curve, but the straight sections, just give them a quick iron. Now you're going to want to lay the main hood inside the lining so that right sides are together, and then you're just going to want to make sure that it's all straight and tight and stuff, and then you're going to pin it with the rabbit fur trim in between the two layers, just like you did on the body of the cloak. It's a little bit tricky, but if you manage so far, you'll be fine. So you can see that I pinned the hood first in a couple places before I started with the rabbit fur trim. That's just so that I know I'm not it's not shifting more, because the lining is slightly, it's not shifting, it's just 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 slightly, it's not sh more flexible, so it's easier for it to all get out of alignment if you're not careful. This is a time-consuming part of the project, but if you take your time now and you're patient, it will give you much less problems in the end. And it will look neater and cleaner if the rabbit fur is not stitched over in places. Once you have it all pinned, you're going to want to take it to the sewing machine and get your zipper foot, and then sew very close to the rabbit fur trim again, just like in the body of the cloak. Now that you've got it all stitched, you're going to want to turn it inside out. Make sure everything still looks good and nothing's stitched wrong. And then you're going to want to pull the fur out of the way and do a top stitch along the edge. Now it's time to start assembling the hood to the main body. You're going to want to find the middle seam of the hood and the very middle of the back and pin those together with the outsides facing each other. Make sure you pin in the middle first, and then slowly you're going to stretch out the curve of the hood until it lies straight. And just keep slowly pinning it. If you have to go back and take out pins, go ahead. This part can be a bit tricky, but just make sure that that it's all good before you go on. Once you've got it all pinned and you're happy with everything and there's no weird wrinkles, take it to your sewing machine and sew with the presser foot as the seam allowance guide. If you want, you can stitch over this twice to make sure that it's very secure, but once is probably fine. Make sure you're catching all four layers of fabric too when you're doing this, because sometimes the lining can be a little bit slippery and you don't realize that there's nothing underneath there. Make sure you backstitch at the ends too, because you do not want this to come undone. And now we're going to clean up the edges a bit. We're going to trim this to about 1/4 of an inch, but don't worry about it too much because we're going to cover it with a ribbon binding. And next is part 3.